son Robbie asked me the other day why my hair is snow white. He asked me because my hair has been this way since I was 27. I'm 45 now, he's 24, and he's a perfectly happy, full-functioning adult. He doesn't remember that it used to be black, nor that it went from black to white in a day. He also doesn't remember why, and I think that's for the best. So I am writing out this story, not for any psychological reasons. A counselor didn't ask me to do this. This is no way therapeutic for me. Instead, I'm writing this much like someone writes down a dream as soon as they wake up, so that the details aren't forgotten. I want to remember this, and I want you all to know, because I think there is a lesson somewhere. Kids make stuff up, and they have overactive imaginations, but it's rare that their imaginations actually scare them, like physically, emotionally, mentally frighten them. If you thought it up, it doesn't scare you because you thought it up. So if your kid comes to you and tells you that something is in their room and it's scaring them, or that they have an imaginary friend that makes them feel uncomfortable, or anything of that matter, please believe them. Believe them enough to check it out, and if it turns out to be nothing, then you have nothing to fear. But don't brush it off immediately. My son was the happiest little boy from day one. He cried about as much as any other newborn child would, but as he grew older and older, his personality came out more and more. He was very resistant. Nothing ever got him down. He made friends easily, and until a particular stage of his life, had never been bullied. When I got pregnant with his sister, when he was just 2, there wasn't one day that went by where he at all felt nervous or uncomfortable with the idea of not being the only child. Even when she was born, he was so excited that he came into the hospital room squealing with joy. My son somehow was the happiest boy in the world. One day, when he was 6, I came into his bedroom to ask him a question, though I don't remember what it was. He was sitting on the floor, cross-legged. His back was rigid, but his head was hanging back, as if he was staring at a dot on the ceiling. His eyes were closed tight as they could be. I smiled because to me, it seemed like one of those random things children do that only makes sense to them, but not to you. I asked him what he was doing, but he didn't respond. I asked again, and still no reply. I spoke his name loudly, and he jumped. His body became softer. I remember he ran his hands up and down his ears. I asked him if he was okay, and what he was doing. He said that the voices were really loud, and he was trying to drown them out. Naturally, this spooked me, so I told my husband later that night. We agreed to keep an eye on him. At the same time, we didn't suspect anything more than just heat exhaustion, as it was the middle of the day in August, and his room had no air conditioner. We thought maybe he had a hallucination. A couple weeks went by, and we noticed subtle changes in him. For instance, he started sleeping less. At first it was just half an hour here and there. We would put him in bed, and when we crawled into our bed, which was the room underneath his, we could hear him talking to himself through the floor. This wasn't alarming to us, because sometimes he would sing to himself to help himself go to sleep. But as the nights went by, the sound of him talking would go longer and longer, to the point where he would just do it for 3 hours before falling asleep, just talking. One night, his sister came into our room and complained that Robbie's consistent mumbling was keeping her up. We even didn't ask her what she thought he was saying, and she only ever heard him say one phrase clearly: "Please, I want to go to sleep. Please, I want to go to sleep." The lack of sleep made him sluggish during the day. He still tried to be his normal, happy, joyful self for the first couple of days, but as the days went on, he just became more zombie-like, almost literally. His skin became pale, and the dark bags under his eyes almost became pure black, and I would find him in his room, often sitting cross-legged, back rigid, eyes shut as they could be. He kept telling us about the voices he was hearing. He wouldn't go into specifics, just that the voices were loud and came to him sporadically. We weren't sure what to believe, because his sister never mentioned hearing anything when she was in the room with him. We had him checked by doctors, and even a psychologist. They gave him some prescriptions, which we filled and gave to him to help him sleep, but no one could tell us what was happening to him. The best guess we heard came from a doctor, who suggested that he was possibly having hallucinations due to a cyst on the brain or something, and he would order for Robbie to have a test done in a few weeks to see what was going on. This made the most sense because it seemed like Robbie was getting sicker by the day. He didn't complain of any pains or anything, just that he was exhausted and that the voices were happening more often. We agreed to the test. Days went by and his condition got worse. Slowly, it seemed like his mental state was wearing thin. He stopped talking as much during the day and chose to seclude himself in quiet places and sit, staring at the wall. Sometimes when he did this, he would cry. We would always try to console him when we could, and when we touched him or talked to him, it would seem that he would snap out of it. We seriously tried everything we could think of to help our boy. Then one night, my husband and I crawled into bed, and we did something we hadn't done in a while. We prayed for him. It was hard to focus because we could hear him talking to himself, but we prayed that whatever cyst or tumor that was causing Robbie to have such vivid hallucinations would be taken from him, even though the test hadn't been done yet, or at the very least, the hallucinations would stop. As we finished the prayer, we heard his talking speed up, but in a monotone kind of way, not like he was panicked, almost like he was put on fast forward. His voice became almost one long moan. I expressed my concern to my husband, when suddenly, Robbie just stopped. We sat in our room, waiting to see what would happen next. What happened next broke my heart. We heard him start to cry, not wailing or moaning, but just the soft sniffles and muffled sobs of a 6-year-old boy. We listened for 5 minutes, waiting to see if he would stop, but we couldn't handle it anymore, and we ran upstairs to his room. We opened the door, and the light of the hallway filled in to illuminate him in his bed. He looked worse because of the tears that stained his little cheeks. The bag under his eyes were large and black. His skin was almost as white as snow, as it seemed to hang off of him like sheets on a clothesline. He looked at us, sniffling and whimpering. We stood in the doorway with a feeling of unease in our stomach. He was gripping his blankets tightly under his chin, to the point where his knuckles were white. The light of the hallway came through the door and lit up his face. But it wasn't the death-like appearance that kept us from immediately walking in. It was his expression. His eyes were locked onto us with intensity. But he wasn't looking at us, almost like he was staring off into space. And when we had opened up the door, his eyes were already locked onto us, like he had been staring at something in this spot, even before we came up. It was the weirdest thing, being looked at without actually being seen. We stood in the doorway for a better part of 2 minutes, unsure of what to do, and the whole time he just looked at us and cried. I walked up to him slowly, his gaze never leaving that glazed over look, and I placed my hand on his shoulder. He jolted and shook his head, snapping out of his stupor. He looked up at me and said nothing, but he didn't have to say anything. Even if I did know, he would just say it was the voices. My husband scooped him up in his arms, and we took him downstairs to our room. Secretly, I thought it was odd for someone to have some hallucination over and over again, but I didn't know anything about the brain or tumors or anything of that sort. If Robbie was really dealing with a brain tumor, there was nothing we could do. If you are a parent, you know that feeling, the feeling of not being able to solve your kids' problems, so you just have to be there for them until they come out of the other end, better or worse. We laid down in our bed and snuggled him between us. We each laid an arm across him. I think that was the best sleep he had in 4 weeks. Now my husband works for the town bureau, which means he usually has to be up and out the door very early, typically around 5 a.m. So waking up and not seeing him was common in our house. But that morning, it wasn't his absence that startled me. No, it wasn't his absence. It was my son's. His eyes were stretched as wide as they could possibly be, and his mouth hung open till his chin touched his chest. His entire body was rigid, stiff as a plank of wood, like he was frozen halfway through a seizure. He didn't blink, and he didn't flinch. He didn't even breathe. His eyes would move and follow me when I moved, but his head wouldn't move with them. And what was worse was that I couldn't see anything in his mouth, like nothing. I couldn't see his tongue. I couldn't see his teeth or gums or palate. Nothing. All I could see was black. He stared at me with that slack-jawed, wide-eyed expression for another 30 seconds. I simultaneously wanted to give him a reassuring touch on the shoulder, as well as a sprint out the door and run to the neighbors. I was so scared, but I mustered up as much courage as I could and said his name softly. Robbie? What erupted from his throat were screams. Screams that came flooding out of the dark hole of his mouth. Not his scream. Literally just screams. Hundreds, thousands, maybe even millions of screams came from his quivering mouth. Screams of men, screams of women, and screams of children. Screams of things that weren't even people. I cupped my hands over my ears so hard that they started ringing. I fell off the side of the bed and crawled till my back was against the wall. There I cowered, weeping, covering my ears and trembling. I watched as my son gently sat up, crawled to the side of the bed, hung his legs over the edge, and sat there screaming. I shut my eyes and curled up into a ball, and laid there in a fetal position, for God knows how long, weeping. He screamed for what felt like over an hour, continuously, not even taking a breath. He didn't even blink the whole time, and when it finally ended, I spent another couple of minutes in that position, eyes closed and ears cupped. I didn't want to open my eyes. I was so worried that he would be right in front of me if I did. When I finally did, I saw him sitting on the edge of the bed, where I had last seen him. He was perfectly still, but color had come back to his face. The bags under his eyes were royal purple, rather than completely black. Something in his eyes told me that my son was back. There were a few moments of silence where we just sat there and stared at each other, and then quietly, and as calm as if nothing ever happened, he whispered, "You heard them too?" My hair went completely white that day, and Robbie didn't have a tumor. I posted this before, but deleted it. I think I'm okay with sharing it now. When I was about 16, I had an experience I will never forget. I am very skeptical, even with the experiences I've had throughout my life. So even telling this story makes it seem a bit surreal. There's a bit of background story, but since I don't want to puke all of my life story, let's just say that from a very young age, my life was constantly filled with negativity, and I believe everything that happened before this experience definitely had something to do with it. I was friends with a group of people who practice Wicca, and it was something I was interested in, so I learned a lot from them before this happened. It's a beautiful craft, and so opening and welcoming. They were more experienced, as they had a few more years of practicing before I had even entered the picture. Anyway, on Halloween, or Samhain, we wanted to pay our respects to those who had passed, and so we decided to cast a circle in our local cemetery. The circle was cast by an angel statue that had been built for the children buried in the cemetery. Now, normally, the door to the circle is closed, but we left it open to invite any spirits to the offerings, food and drink. My friend, Katie, went off on her own to speak with someone who had just died a month before, and my other friend, Meg, and I just stayed in the circle, both silent as we did our own thing. I was upset and already at a vulnerable point in my life, and I was dealing with depression from the death of my father. He had committed suicide when I was 6, and I wanted some peace. I wanted to hear from him and understand how he could leave his family like that. I opened the door even wider. A rush of wind came in the circle and knocked Meg over on her butt, landing on her black mirror. A black mirror is used for scrying in Wicca, breaking it, which means bad luck. She was spooked by it, but I didn't experience anything. I was completely quiet. She told me to go get Kate, so I stood up and told her to come back to the circle. She was reluctant, but came back with me anyways. When we were all in the circle, Meg told Kate about what had happened, so we started picking up the food and other things in the middle of the circle, so we could officially close it. I can't explain to you what it feels like. The best way to describe it is like something is invading your space. It's uncomfortable, and it's almost like it's trying to shove you out of the way to make a room. I literally felt like two different people, and the invader was trying to gain control. Meg noticed I looked different, and asked if I was okay. I didn't answer her. And then I crouched down on the ground, my nails digging into the dirt, and I was swaying back and forth. Before I knew it, I turned away from them, threw back my head, and let out a piercing, high-pitched scream that lasted for about a minute. After the scream slowly died off, I started shaking, and turned to them. I remember saying, "Something's wrong," and then they grabbed me by the arms and kept me still, and started saying Wiccan prayer. I tried saying it with them at first, but I literally growled before I could even finish the sentence. I felt like I had no control. I felt hatred and anger, but I kept trying, and eventually I could say it, and began to feel like a weight had been lifted off me. We closed the circle, went home, and that was that. We didn't talk about it. I laid in bed, thinking I would never be in a vulnerable state like that again, that I would be strong. I imagined a white shield surrounding my house and myself. I started working more with energy and stepped away from any type of religion, focusing more on the spiritual. Not because I didn't like Wicca. I knew things had to change. I never told my mom or any of my friends. It was just the two of them and me. Was it a demon? Who knows? People think demons are the only things I can possess, but when a spirit has enough energy, there is a whole lot more that they can do. So nothing extravagant, no speaking in tongues or throwing people twice my size, just something that ended quickly, but changed my life, and my perspective, forever. It has been over 20 years since these events have occurred. I did not feel like I would ever tell my story until I came across this subreddit. I was reluctant to share what happened to me because I did not feel like arguing against doubt and disbelief and or defending my own sanity. Here I can tell you with less of those fears. This is what took place, as best as I can remember. In the late 1980s, as a curious teen, I became fascinated with the occult. As a child growing up in a religious household, my first exposure to occult themes came from the Bible. I always strained to understand my beliefs concerning the teachings of the church, and especially struggled with those with my own faith in God. After learning that demons were former angels who had rebelled against God and were cast down to earth and could interact with humans, I came to the conclusion that the best way to prove to myself that God existed was to see if demons existed. There was no internet back then to explore my questions and sate my curiosity. Knowledge of the occult was hard to come by and had to be searched for in libraries and bookstores. In time, I collected a small library of books about witchcraft and demonology. Looking back, I realized how foolish I was. I didn't understand what I was getting myself into. Those books have since been destroyed after what happened to me. I began reading these books and actively trying to invite demons into my life. I read out loud long strings of demonic names out of the books. I would cast spells and draw symbols on my walls and floors. Nothing happened. I had a few strange dreams, but that wasn't proof of anything. Then one day, I came across a paragraph that told me to get a full clove of garlic and stake it with a large iron nail to attract demonic power to a place. I did this and put the staked clove deep into my closet. The demons didn't come to me suddenly with a large fanfare. They came gradually, insidiously, working their way into my life and psyche without me hardly noticing, until they were ready. Then they pounced, and I was almost destroyed. I woke up more frequently with nightmares. I woke up sometimes listening intently because I could have sworn that what had awoken me was laughter or whispering. I passed these off as dreams. Sometimes I woke up paralyzed for a few seconds. I passed this off as sleep paralysis. I woke up sometimes with all the sheets on the floor, far from the bed. I woke some nights thinking, was my bed just moving? I passed this off as restless sleep. Then one night, I woke up to watch my hand and arm shoot from my side, grab the lamp on my night table, and throw it across the room with such force that it pulled my shoulder out and the lamp practically exploded against the opposite wall. I sat in the dark, cradling my arm, wondering how I could do such a thing of dead sleep. A few nights later, I did the same thing with a new lamp, with the same arm. I had to wear a sling to restrict movement of my shoulder. A few nights later, it happened one more time, but I didn't grab the lamp. I tore the sling right off my neck. I thought these things were very strange, but I still proceeded to invite these demons into my house. I was still not convinced. I was a fool. I became irritable, and my family started to notice. I became lazy with my schoolwork, distant and withdrawn, and argumentative. My parents thought I might be on drugs. I was brought to a psychologist who tested me for them and diagnosed me with depression. I told no one what I was up to. Over time, the odd occurrences increased, but due to time and space and some embarrassment, I will leave some out. I will tell you that late one night, I awoke to the full moon shining on my face through a window. I debated telling you this part because it sounds so strange, but I began growling at the moon. I remember not thinking as myself. My thoughts were basic and primal. I began growling at the moon more ferociously, until I practically was foaming at the mouth and snapping at the moon like a rabid animal. I eventually snapped out of this, and was wondering what the hell I was doing. I didn't know yet, but at this point, the demons were ready to pounce. They felt they had weakened me enough and worn down the walls between worlds within my room to extract my soul from my body. These next recollections are the most vivid in my mind. One night, I awoke and felt very strange. I felt a jarring disjointedness. Then part of myself lifted out of my feet, then worked up my body until I was floating above the bed. It felt something like if you were to smoothly pull a piece of tape off a flat surface. I was floating above my bed and looking down at myself. I tried to move, but knew somehow that I would have to try to learn. After being amazed at what was happening, I then felt something grab me by my feet, or the lower part of myself, and started to violently shake me like a rag doll. I felt like a streamer being whipped back and forth. I saw one side of the room, then the other, flash before my eyes. Something was trying to tear me away from a connection I still had to my body lying on the bed. I was terrified, and I knew that whatever it was doing to me, and if it succeeded, I would die. But the cord, I don't know what it is, tying me to my body was too strong. They could not break it. They gave up and let go, and I floated lazily up to the ceiling. I remember distinctly my cheek resting lightly against the ceiling of the room. I set my eyes on a specific imperfection on the ceiling I had studied many times from below, but it was now a few inches from my face. I remember thinking how it looked different from there. Suddenly I was in bed, looking at the ceiling where I was. I was taking deep breaths, like I needed air. I felt strange, and I was paralyzed with fear. I felt my chest getting heavy, and I took a deep breath, but the feeling stayed. Now I felt as if I was being pushed down, but did not feel any pressure in a specific place. It was as if some invisible weight had been draped over my torso, and was getting heavier. I remember thinking that it was just a dream. There's no way any of this actually happened. Then I heard a sound I will never forget for as long as I live. I heard the sound of the bed creaking. I was sinking into the bed, and the sound of the bed warping under the increasing weight was real. This was really happening. In a frenzy of fear, I burst out of the bed and ran out of the room and the house. I went to my sister's house, who lived next door, and woke her up to let me in. I was wide-eyed and hyperventilating. She eventually calmed me down and began asking questions. I did not tell her about what I had been doing, and told her that I saw a ghost. She laughed it off and told me to stay the night if I wanted to. I stayed, but I did not sleep again that night. By the next day, I knew what I had to do, so I went back to the house and up to my room. I quickly went to the closet, grabbed the clove of garlic with the stake nail, which was now black, and took it outside. My parents' house is made of stone, and I found the largest open space of the wall with no windows, and threw the clove against the stone. I swear the thing exploded against the wall, like I had thrown a grenade. There was nothing left. I never found a piece of that clove or the nail. I threw all occult materials, objects, and books I had into the wood stove and burned them. I cleaned the symbols off the walls and furniture, and I never slept in that room again. Nothing like I have ever told you ever happened to me again. I think whatever demonic and human thing it was had their one chance, but they failed, and they never bothered me again. So, do I now believe in God? Surprisingly, I'm still not sure that I do. But I do know that there are absolutely malicious entities in this world, and if you invite them into your life, they will gladly come in. Hey guys, Drybones here. Thanks for watching the video. be sure to smash that like button and give requests on types of stories you want to hear in the future. I notice you guys prefer Skinwalker stories most of the time, but I want to mix things up. Be sure to show some love for my ghost story video if you enjoyed this one. Skinwalkers are terrifying, but ghosts may actually be among you, or in your room this very second. I love you guys, and as always, I'm blessed to have such great subscribers. See you in the next video. Oh yeah, and one last thing. Stay spooky, my friend.